Someone who's struggling through abuse has an initial injury, right? The injury of what took place. But when they go and tell someone in leadership, someone in their congregation, a friend, and that friend dismisses it, denies it, diminishes it, tells them to be silent, maybe even for what they think is good reasons. Do you really want to call it that? That would really harm the church or this other person if it's not really abuse. That second injury is sometimes as terrible for that victim as the first injury. Sometimes it's larger, because here again, somebody who I trusted, who I thought would be on my side, who would understand what I've gone through, has told me it didn't happen.
People of faith, oftentimes that is the most important aspect of who you are. And to have that so upended, to lose a whole community, to lose your connection to God through the church. I feel like now my journey is, how do I find God without the church?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for our Interrupt the Pattern Keynote address. My name is Pete Singer. I'm the Executive Director here at GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, and we are just thrilled to have you with us tonight. We have an important night tonight, both because of the speakers that we're going to hear, Kathy and Tim Wiens and Dr. Phil Monroe, but also because of the purpose for tonight. And the purpose for tonight is to introduce you to our Interrupt the Pattern campaign. As part of the Interrupt the Pattern campaign, we really have a three-pronged goal. One, to help people hear the voice of survivors. As survivors use their voice, that people will listen and hear what is said. To safeguard the vulnerable, to help make our churches and ministries a safer place, and to advance cultural change. This is absolutely not about a checklist. If it's just a checklist, it will fail. This has to be about the very culture of the church, the way that we see who we are in Christ and how central our calling in Christ is to protecting and safeguarding kids and anyone in our faith communities. We'd invite you to help and contribute to GRACE as we go about this work, and the incredible need. The demand has been so astronomical and has grown so fast over the last few years. Whereas once we would get between 2 and 4 inquiries a week, we are now getting 2 to 4 inquiries a day of people asking for help, of churches asking for help. In 2021 alone, we spoke with over 500 churches and survivors reaching out, asking for help. And we're now at the point where we used to do between 2 and 4 investigations a year, we are doing 15 to 20 investigations a year. All of this in an effort to help the voice of survivors be heard, to safeguard the vulnerable, and to advance cultural change. And to do that, we need to increase our capacity because of this incredibly increasing demand. And so tonight we ask that you would help us to increase our capacity and continue in this important work. As we get started, we want to start by listening to the voice of survivors. Kathy Wiens and Tim Wiens were part of an investigation that GRACE did some time ago. And as we talked to them and prepared for tonight, they graciously agreed to share some of their experience. This is a pre-recorded interview with them, and I invite you to listen to the words of Kathy and Tim Wiens. Hi, I'm talking today with Kathy and Tim Wiens, and thank you both very much for joining us for this conversation today. Both of you have some very personal experience as well as professional experience as it comes to abuse in our churches and in our faith communities. You were both a part of a grace investigation. Kathy as a survivor, and Tim as the main person who brought light to what was going on and as a strong advocate for those who were hurt in that church. And you've both continued your work, Kathy, as you support survivors of abuse, survivors of faith-based abuse, and Tim with your work with the Mennonite Abuse Prevention Organization. Thank you both so much for that work and for agreeing to share a little of your story with us tonight. I think my first question is, what was it like for you to be a part of a grace investigation?
Well, the ultimate outcome was really positive for us. You know, it was scary going into it because we didn't know what the grace investigation would be. You know, we had gotten pushback from the church because we had wanted there to be open and transparency about what had happened and to dig deeper into the crimes of the perpetrator that was in our church. But after we had the grace report, after it was read, it was very validating to us. It really supported the things that we had believed all along that the church should do. And just really validated us. For me as a survivor, it had been an extremely hard journey up to that point because I was triggered and re-traumatized by many of the things that was happening in the church, and I was experiencing new traumatization by the way the church was handling it. And so to have, the grace report say a lot of the things that I had felt about the situation was very validating and healing.
Yeah, it was very scary. It was terrifying at points in the grace investigation. I was kind of a wreck just before the report came out, worrying that I would be thrown under the bus. See, in my church, as the whistleblower, an advocate, and also the one who advocated and pushed for grace to be brought into to be brought on and to do the investigation. I was the focus of a lot of blame and shame and accused of causing more harm than good. And so I was fearful that the investigation would throw me under the bus, just to be frank. And it was such a relief, and it was so validating, and it was so healing to see that the investigation outlined all of the abuse and all of the betrayal, institutional betrayal that had gone on in our congregation. So it was a real roller coaster for me.
And there was also some fear because it was a faith-based organization, and the church is a faith-based organization. But, it really, we were very validated by it. It felt very honoring of what survivors had gone through in that experience, and also recognizing that we need to have accountability and boundaries for perpetrators.
I think that's a central piece. A lot of times these investigations and these assessments are a way to give survivors a voice, for those thoughts to be heard, for those feelings to be heard. How is that process of giving voice to survivors? How does that play into the healing journey for somebody who's experienced something like what you did?
Well, it's very validating. And just being heard and being seen is very validating. It lessens the isolation, and that also lessens the shame. Shame is a big part of sexual abuse, and also of the kind of abuse that you experience when a church doesn't handle these situations well, and you're shamed by the church. Not only do you feel shamed because of the sexual abuse you experienced, whether you're the current victim of the church or you've experienced it in your past, it still brings all of that up, and it brings all of that shame. And then when the church protects the perpetrator, that just brings even more shame. And so having a voice is very healing, because someone actually sees you and cares about you. And, it may sound very simple, but studies have shown that just asking people what happened to them can be very helpful, because people don't normally share their abuse that's happened to them in the past. But if someone asks them what happened to you, that can be a very healing part of it.
I'm not an expert in by any means in sexual abuse, but I am a recently retired physician, and I realize as a physician that physicians aren't the ones that do healing. And I think in the same way, grace, whether it's grace or whether it's pastors or whether it's churches or whoever, we don't help someone heal. The person heals from within. And I think the role of a physician is to provide the right environment to give the person what they need, to give them their basic human rights, to give them their basic empowerment as a human being, to live in a health, to enable health to develop. And in the same way, this is what grace provided for us. It provided an understanding of the trauma that we had experienced. It provided, a prioritization for safety, prioritization for the needs of human beings that were traumatized. And it was very healing just because it gave us what we needed.
Wow, I love that description of providing the environment where healing can occur. That's powerful. That's wow. So you made it through a grace investigation. It was difficult. It was very scary and probably somewhat anxiety producing.
Mm-hmm.
But as you look back at it now, you can look back at it on the perspective of somebody who's been through the investigation, but also somebody who has survived that abuse, continuing on your journey after the abuse, but who has survived it. As you look back, what do you wish your church would have done differently that would have prioritized the needs of victims and survivors?
There are two big things, as we were thinking about doing this interview, two big things came to mind for me. And this is what I see with other victims and survivors that I work with. I wish so much that churches would not vilify the ones who bring the issue to the table, whether that's the victim, other survivors, or another, whistleblower. But so often I see that those people are the ones that are vilified. There's a documentary called Sins of the Amish. And one of the statements that they make in that documentary is that the crime of sexual abuse that was committed is not the worst thing. Talking about it, bringing it out into the open, that's the true harm that's been done. And so just honoring and thanking the person that brings it out into the open, because that is such a healing process to do, and for churches to be open to that and to do that.
This experience of someone close to us becoming and being a sexual offender, and then that suddenly being revealed in our own small group setting and in our Sunday school class setting, was a very traumatic event, and that set Kathy and I on a journey, and that journey basically took us to a different continent than what our church was on. The continent that we discovered was a continent of survivor-centeredness, a continent of where child safety was prioritized, a continent where survivors were empowered and asked to lead, to lead the process, a continent where we would talk about and process sexual abuse. And I tried to explain this, that when I was talking to the Sunday school class, it's like we're coming at it from totally different cultures. And so I wish that the church, that our Sunday school class, that everyone would move toward the survivor-centered continent. This place where people are respected, where victims and survivors are honored, where they're believed, where they're listened to, where we prioritize the safety of children and vulnerable people rather than the people who are in power, the people who are part of our group, where we don't minimize someone because maybe they're not a member of the church. This was a big deal in our particular situation.
Wow. I like that, seeing it as a continent, and let's move there. Let's be there, because that's where we're called to be.
And to just have the eyes to see that's where we need to get to, and not to have so much self-protection. I think maybe that was what I was thinking of, to try and primarily protect the institution, but to, like Tim was saying, to really care about and prioritize and understand what sexual abuse is and how it affects victims and survivors.
Yeah, it's essential. It's essential. And so many times that isn't what happens. And it's not what you experienced, unfortunately. But thinking of it, can you help us even just understand from your personal experience, if your church had done that, if your church had been on the survivor-centered continent, how would that have changed your experience?
We would be in a whole different place today.
Yeah.
I mean,
we would still be a part of the church.
Yeah. We wouldn't have lost our whole community.
Yeah. We've lost that faith community.
Mm-hmm. It would be that, it's hard for someone, like you were saying, it's hard for people who haven't experienced this to really know what it's like. And it's hard to understand the depth. And again, the victims and the survivors that I work with, to see how much they have lost when churches respond inappropriately to abuse situations. Our faith really is the most important aspect of who we are for many people, not for everyone, of course, but people of faith, oftentimes that is the most important aspect of who you are. And to have that so upended, to lose a whole community, to lose your connection to God through the church. I feel like now my journey is, how do I find God without the church? And, how do I connect again with Jesus and my relationship to Jesus? Because, that's broken. I mean, it's not severed, but it's bent, it's broken. And that's the journey for me. That's the journey back to find that. And if they had responded appropriately, if they had truly cared for what I was experiencing, rather than focusing on what the perpetrator was going through and what his family, his wife was going through, that would have made all the difference for me. And I would be, in a very different place. And the reality is, we may not be having this conversation if that had happened.
We've talked about what it would mean for us personally, but what it would mean for for the people in the church, for the children in the church, for other victims, for other survivors in the church would have been far, unimaginably much greater good. The safety of the church, the health of the congregation, the empowerment of the survivors that are in that congregation would have received so much more benefit.
Yeah, it's a personal change. It's a personal benefit, but it's for the community as a whole. Everyone then benefits with more safety, more care, and really a community that reflects the heart of God.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Wow. Well, Kathy and Tim, thank you so much for sharing some of your journey with us tonight, some of your story, and the things that you've experienced and the insight that you've gained from that. We're all the richer for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for letting us share with you.
Yeah, thanks.
It's a privilege.
I think Kathy and Tim were so powerful as they shared their experience in a church that struggled as abuse occurred in that church, and many people ended up being hurt. They shared some powerful pieces of how their experience ended up intersecting with grace, how it helped them to find and use their voice, how that voice and being able to speak about what had happened serves as one of the most powerful tools in safeguarding everyone in the community. And that as the voice of survivors is heard, as safeguarding becomes a priority, this spreads into every aspect of the church and becomes a hallmark of our culture, bringing us, as Tim said, onto a different continent, a survivor-centered continent. And I think this is what we are called to do, as it reflects the heart of God. And as we do this, it will have a powerful impact on people, and it will have a powerful impact for the kingdom of God. Thank you, Kathy and Tim, so much for sharing your hearts with us tonight. We're going to move on to the next phase of tonight, and that is hearing from Dr. Phil Monroe. Phil is the leader of Langberg, Monroe and Associates. If you're familiar with Diane Langberg, that is also where Diane Langberg practices. He is a psychologist and the director of the Trauma Healing Institute at the American Bible Society, and he founded and helps lead the Global Trauma Recovery Institute at Missio Seminary. He's also an adjunct professor of counseling at Missio Seminary. Phil has been involved with Grace for quite some time, even for a while serving on our board of directors. And so it's great, Phil, to have you rejoin us. You've been on some Grace Live conversations, which we've really appreciated. And now tonight, our keynote speaker. As Phil talks, please feel free to use the chat to share some reflections during his conversation. And please also use the Q&A feature. Toward the end of tonight, we're hoping that we'll be able to get to one or two questions that our listeners have. So if you could please add those to the Q&A, that would be great. It's possible that we won't get to all those questions. So if we don't get to your question, please feel free to email me that question, and someone at Grace or Phil Monroe will reply to that question. And my email is pete@netgrace.org. And that's in the chat right now. So with that being said, Phil, can you please share some of your heart with us tonight?
Well, thank you, Pete. And it's great to be here with you, with Grace, supporting what you do. I am delighted to be here and delighted to follow Kathy and Tim. What a powerful testimony. You know, as I was listening to them, I got thinking about the fact that we all want to be like Grace, right? With the same goals that you just talked about, which is giving voice and space for victims. Part of their healing journey is listening to what happened to them and centering that part of the voice. It is working on safeguarding policies to prevent future trauma and abuse. And of course, in doing so, Lord willing, changing the culture to make it a place where the heart of Jesus, the heart of God about injustice and love and protection is centered and not a leader-centered approach. And so they talked about that. And one of the things that came out about that is the sad reality that though we all are against abuse and trauma, something can happen in our institutions and even with us where we get weak in the knees, where somebody who we really respect and value or our organization is now touched by an allegation, and we're not sure if we're going to be quite so willing to center a victim's voice. It happens over and over. Everyone's against trauma and abuse, and yet our institutions and we can get weak. And why is that? I think that's worth us spending some time talking. And I don't really have planned to do that tonight, but I still think, why is that? Why wouldn't we center their voices? And sometimes I think we heard from Kathy as well, there's self-protection. Tim talked about the fact that, there was a worry. What's going to happen when I become a whistleblower or speak up about this or bring light to something? What will happen to me? We sense the loss of safety and security, and it can be difficult to do this. And we worry about either our own reputations or the reputations of those we've sponsored and supported all these years. But it's worth asking that question for ourselves. What might be the barrier for me to listening well and supporting well a victim who comes forward? So with that said, let's start with some of the things we can do in order to create a better culture in our institutions, our churches, our communities, and in ourselves. The first thing is, well, we can understand what is trauma. We can understand how people heal and how we can participate, as Tim said, create the environment that will make it possible for people to heal from within. So what is trauma? Is trauma an event? Not really. It's an experience from event or events that happen. And that experience often has horror and helplessness, a silencing effect. It can be anything from a natural disaster, of course, to what Grace is often dealing with, which is abuse, emotional, spiritual, sexual abuse for children, vulnerable people, and adults. Such event leads to a chronic experience, and that chronic experience usually leads to three symptoms, and that is re-experiencing of the event over and over again, coming in not as a remembering it, but reliving it. Then, of course, because you're reliving a horror and a nightmare, you try to avoid it by numbing, shutting it down, not feeling, not talking about it, going silent. But that doesn't usually work, and so it leaves you always on alert and vigilant about the next disaster. You don't trust yourself, you don't trust others, and that is a very isolated and disconnected place to be. There are two other kinds of trauma that I want to talk about, and that is betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma is a kind of trauma that happens when someone who should love and protect, have our safety in first priority, is the one who harms us, who uses us. That can be a spiritual leader, that can be a parent, that can be a Sunday school teacher, all sorts of people. Someone, again, who's intended to be our support and protection, our caregiver, is the person who is actually the cause of our trauma, betrayal trauma. And then spiritual abuse and spiritual trauma is something that many of us are talking about for the first time. And if you want to explore more on that, you could look up and just Google Christianity Today and Scott McKnight on spiritual abuse, and you'll get an an essay that he wrote where he is bringing in a definition that was created by some other folks in the UK on that. But what you see in spiritual abuse is someone of spiritual leadership or another who is using spiritual and religious terms, ideas, beliefs to control someone, to manipulate them, to get them to be silenced, to get them to obey, but using those spiritual language, words, meaning, or position to control another person. There is one more trauma I want to tell you about, and this is all one that we may be in danger of committing. You see, someone who's struggling through abuse has an initial injury, right? The injury of what took place. But when they go and tell someone in leadership, someone in their congregation, a friend, and that friend dismisses it, denies it, diminishes it, tells them to be silent, maybe even for what they think is good reasons. Do you really want to call it that? That would really harm the church or this other person if it's not really abuse. That second injury is sometimes as terrible for that victim as the first injury. Sometimes it's larger, because here again, somebody who I trusted, who I thought would be on my side, who would understand what I've gone through, has told me it didn't happen. It's not that important. Well, at least you didn't have X, Y, and Z happening. You need to get over it. You need to forgive. All those things that we can do at that point can create a second and even larger wound. So that's what trauma is, an invisible wound of the heart that has lasting effects, that is hard to see and hard to understand if you haven't had that experience. How in the world does anybody heal from that? Well, it's a long process. Imagine right now that your house burned down. And it just didn't burn down because there was some bad wiring or some fluke thing that happened, but it was because somebody in your neighborhood came and torched your house. Well, think about this. You have a lot of needs, and you need basic things: a place to sleep. You need safety and security. You need to understand, where can I go because I don't know who burned down my house. Or I do know who it was, and I don't know if I'm still going to be safe, even if I move a house over or into an apartment. Will they come after me again? Imagine that. So what does a person need to heal? Well, they need basic, common sense, mercy ministry, spaces to talk if they want or not to talk, safe environments to just be themselves and not just to be a victim, somebody who's going to help them with their sleeping and their eating and their basic life. We talk about safety and security first in trauma healing. And then that moves to when a person is now getting ready to start to talk about it and to explore what happened to them, examine the narratives that they've been telling themselves or that others have been telling themselves, right? And in that process of talking, and that's what both Pete was talking about and Tim and Kathy were talking about, space to say what happened without somebody judging it, evaluating it, deciding whether it was worthy of trauma or not. That's really what people need, and they need that repetition over and over again. And that takes time. Just like if you blew out your knee, you would expect it to take time to heal. You would also expect trauma to take a long time to heal for some people, especially if it went on for a long time and was the betrayal trauma sort. So we understand just a tiny little bit about what is trauma and abuse. How do we begin to heal? How are we going to help create that environment? That's really the question that we all have. And some of you who are on this call may be supporters and helpers, church leaders. Others of you may be yourselves survivors of your own trauma, and you want to help others. What is it that we can do to create that space? Well, let's talk backwards on those three things that Grace is interested in: giving voice, safeguarding, and helping to change the culture of a church that is more survivor-centric. Well, let's talk about the recovery side. You know, some of the times we helpers become what I would call benevolent dictators. We can see a person in pain and we don't want them to be in pain. And so we begin to try to push And we're pushing for what we think are good things. You got to talk about it. You need to be in church. You need to trust. You need to trust again. You got to try. And we have good intentions, but no one ever gets controlled into healing. You cannot manipulate into healing. You cannot use the things of trauma and abuse, which is control, manipulation, even if you have good intentions, for healing. The person who has suffered this kind of abuse needs the freedom to not trust you, needs the freedom to not trust church leaders, needs the freedom to not be pressed into forgiveness, right? So some of the things that we can do as environmental support is to give space. We can listen over and over again. Some of you might think, well, I've been listening for a long time. Well, a person who's telling their story is trying to make sense of the insensible, so it's going to take time. The second thing, besides listening and not getting in the way and not telling people what to think and do, is to lament with them. The scriptures are full of laments, and laments are complaints to God and to each other about the things that are not supposed to be. They're not neat, they're not nice, they are often cries of the heart that have no answer. Do the dead praise you, says the psalmist? It ends with, in Psalm 88, darkness is my closest friend. Can we support that and sing those same lines with those who have suffered? This, in fact, would be culture change in the church if we started doing this, making that kind of space for that. The scriptures invite these kinds of cries of our heart. God seems not disturbed by them. Why are we? Can we be people who invite and support and encourage and participate in individual and corporate lament over the bad behavior of some and also of our institutions that have not supported their recovery? So that's the first thing we can do to support voices. What about safeguarding? I have a dear friend who's an EMT, and she would tell you that they have to practice over and over when they're not on an ambulance run, how they take care of different kinds of problems. They have their policies and procedures, they've learned them, but they can't allow those policies and procedures to collect dust. They can't have them sitting on the shelf and not paying attention to them. No, they practice the most basic things. Under pressure, when it really matters, you want to make sure your EMT knows how to do what they need to do to save your life, right? Why can we not, as grace supporters, be part of that? When we are building safeguarding policies, we need to practice. How are we going to respond when our beloved pastor or worship leader or Sunday school teacher or anybody or ourselves are accused of something? How are we going to respond? What are our procedures? If we wait until an event happens, we probably won't be ready for it. And the final area, besides giving voice and safeguarding, is culture change. And that, my friends, is probably the hardest thing for us to consider. How can we support culture change? The very first way we do is finding ways we're starting to talk about the very heart of God towards those who would speak up about things that are not right in amidst us. We have a tendency to platform people who make us feel good. We have a tendency to platform leaders who bring us the word and encourage us. But what if we began by platforming those who talk about what has been broken and what needs to be fixed? What if we listen to our canaries in the coal mine who are telling us that our air is toxic? So part of our church culture change would be lamenting more, giving space for these kinds of stories that we just heard from Kathy and Tim, and asking, how will we fare? How have we done? Are there things that we can correct in our past that we could do better now, right? So I'm so grateful for Grace. I have to tell you, as a psychologist, their work helps me do my work better. My clients have a sense that there are people out there who will listen, that even if they can't get justice in their story, they're seeing other people get justice and when they see others getting justice and they see church leaders supporting that recovery and change, well, they are amazed, and they are starting to find healing of themselves, right? For themselves. So remember and preach the good news that Jesus has come to heal and to release captives. And notice in Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 4, where in fact, Jesus is speaking about his ministry in the Gospels, right? Where he is talking about himself. He actually ends in verse 4, talking about those who have been traumatized. You, those who have been harmed, you will rebuild the broken cities. You will repair what has been lost. You know, it's not the healthy that are going to bring this healing. It's those who have recovered themselves and will lead us to healing. Thank you, Grace, for what you do, and grateful to be here. And Pete, how we can help, let us know.
Thank you so much, Phil. I think really just an inspiring message of the heart that we need to have when it comes to addressing abuse of all types in our faith communities, in our churches and ministries. It underlies the importance of not just a checklist of things to do, but to have this come back to our identity, who we are in Christ, and the culture that really defines us. As you were talking, Phil, one of the things that came to mind is you hit on each of these areas, giving voice to survivors, safeguarding the vulnerable, and advancing cultural change. Let's say that somebody first approaches me and lets me know that they have experienced abuse. Can you give me what would be like one key important thing, like one or two of the most important specific things that I could do, both as a leader and as a friend?
That's a great question. I think the very first thing is to acknowledge the courage that took place for them to speak, because everything in their being is telling them to be quiet. The shame that they feel, the self-doubt that they feel, the trust that it takes for them to say something has happened is an amazing, courageous act. Acknowledge that. Have curiosity and compassion for them. Express that. The curiosity, I don't mean curiosity like rubbernecking at a crash. I mean curiosity, you know, tell me what happened. How did that make you feel? What's been the hardest part for you? That's showing curiosity that you matter as a person and I'm seeing you. We rush to like, oh no, I've got to do something. We've got to fix something and we want to start acting. But just slow down. This person started to tell you something. You are now walking on holy ground. Take your shoes off and listen.
I love that, holy ground. Yes, it is. Wow. We had a question come in as well. What would you say are probably 2 or 3 of the most important practices for a church to transform its culture to become trauma sensitive?
Great question. One of the first things I would say, the church is primarily often about preaching and teaching. So let's start preaching and teaching on the reality that we see of trauma and its impact. We have this in the scriptures. We see all sorts of things that are traumatizing. We have Tamar, and we can see the impact of what was done and the silencing that happened to her by her brother and the inaction by her father, David. Let's start talking about some of these things. When you talk about it in a way that shows that you care about victims and that justice matters, on things, and that it's not just a problem out there, but it could be in our own midst, you are telling people in your midst, like, oh, this place takes this seriously. So you want to become trauma informed, start preaching and teaching on it. But of course, in order to preach and teach on it, you better study on it. So let's learn about it. Bring people in who can be your experts and talk. Have a Sunday school class on it. Have, I work for the American Bible Society in the past, and they have trauma healing groups that they have helped create a curriculum for, and you can find out how to start one of those in your own congregation. So create space for those kinds of things. And in doing so, and if you really want to be trauma sensitive, if you have that courageous person who wants to speak up about their experience, ask them for input. What are we doing that might be getting in the way of creating a healing space for you? Listen.
Yeah. Wow, those are all so important. And there are resources out there. I think a lot of times faith leaders are afraid that they're going to get it wrong and don't know how to bring it up. And am I supposed to have a designated number of sermons that I preach on abuse every year, or what specifically am I supposed to say? And I think one of the things that we often talk to pastors about and teachers about is it's not about a specific number of sermons a year or lessons a year on it. It's about watching for how it intersects with your lessons all the time, because it does. If you're giving a lesson about forgiveness, it's going to intersect. If you're giving a lesson about anger, it's going to intersect. If you're giving a lesson about relationships, it's going to intersect. If you're giving a lesson about parents, it's going to intersect. If you're it's going to intersect, and constantly be looking how we can bring that into our teaching. And like you said, recognizing that this isn't a new thing that we're grappling with today, but this is something that is addressed directly in Scripture, whether it is Tamar and just the horror of that story and how it ripped apart a family, how it ripped apart a kingdom, and how it shows those abuse dynamics. Or even going further back, Hophni and Phinehas, who are called worthless men. Worthless men. Why are they worthless men? Because they use their position as faith leaders to gain access to sexual activity with women.
Yeah.
And it's throughout Scripture. There's plenty to teach on, whether it's a specific sermon or just talking about how it impacts a topic you're already going to be addressing.
Yeah.
Why do you think, and this will be our last question. I know that there's another question in there that we're not going to get to, and I would ask you, if you feel comfortable doing so, to email me that question so that I can follow up on it. Again, my email is pete@netgrace.org. But for our last question, before we start wrapping things up, why do you think church leaders are so hesitant to not just address it, but to get angry about it? To actually have anger, because it certainly seems that God has anger about this.
Yeah.
So why can't we?
Yeah. Throughout the scriptures, the Old and the New Testament, you see how God responds, whether through the prophets, through Jesus, in when injustice takes place, especially on the most vulnerable. And you will have to ask yourself, why are you also not incensed with these same things? That's a great question. I would like to know more as well. I do think sometimes to get angry about this, some of times the people who are accused have been the ones who are most likely to attack me as well. And I might feel like my position is going to be at risk if I put the whole institution in an uproar by standing up for this. because I will be seen, as we heard Tim saying this, I will be seen potentially as the one who the anger goes towards, because I am disturbing the peace of the congregation. And probably, well, I don't know Tim and Kathy's story, but it seems like it was disturbed enough that they had to leave. So I don't know that story, but I think that that's probably one of the reasons why leaders aren't doing as much, as they freeze, and then they are concerned that if they say things, that they will in fact get the ire of the congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. Afraid of the impact it may have for them. I think one of the things that comes into play too is for whatever reason, I think we look at this type of trauma differently than other forms of trauma. Mike, who is our director of safeguarding here at Grace, gives this analogy. He says, all right, picture this. I've just finished visiting your church. And now after visiting your church, I walk out to the parking lot. And as I walk out to the parking lot, for whatever reason, somebody in your church is really, really mad at me. And because they're really, really mad at me, they run me over with their car. Everybody hears this noise. The person then stops, can't believe what he did, even though he intended to do it. And this was an intentional running over Mike with a car. Everybody rushes to the scene, and the guy hops out of the car. And as soon as he hops out of the car, he starts saying, wait, everybody. You need to know I'm sorry. Everybody, please forgive me. And people are trying to get around him to get to help Mike. And he keeps on saying, but wait, please forgive me. I'm sorry. And finally, people get around him and they get to Mike. And Mike is clearly seriously injured. He's bleeding all over the parking lot. And people finally get to Mike. And as they reach Mike, they say, Mike, have you forgiven him yet? No, they'd call 911. But yet somehow when it turns into abuse, our first question is, have you forgiven them yet? Rather than, how can we care for you? And we miss the need to just care because we see it somehow as a different type of injury, a different type of assault.
Totally agree. And because it's invisible, it didn't really happen. We don't understand the depth of that wound. That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And so we can get angry. But in order to get angry, we need to talk about it. And as we talk about it, the voices of survivors can be heard. Phil, I loved how you talked about having those voices heard is a essential piece of healing. As a person is silenced, it's just wound after wound after wound. But as a person's voice is heard, as they're able to take back some of the power that was taken to stand against the silencing that is often there, at least by the perpetrator, if not by some of the surrounding community, that helps with the healing as we sit with the survivor, as we hear the survivor. Often that's one of the central things that we try and do at Grace through our institutional response team. Our institutional response team does investigations and organizational assessments. And when we head in to do that work, we sit with survivors and we listen to their stories and we help to convey their stories to church leadership and sometimes the entire congregation as the survivor feels is most appropriate. And giving voice in this way can become a part of that person's healing journey. Again, as I mentioned, right now, Grace is doing 15 to 20 investigations and assessments a year. Phil, you also talked about the importance of safeguarding the vulnerable. Kathy and Tim talked about the importance of this as well. And this also is central to the mission of Grace. Our safeguarding team works with churches to look at their policies and procedures. How can we have boundaries and safeguards in place so that we have the opportunity to notice something before it goes all the way into full-fledged, egregious, tangible abuse, and to where it's concerning behavior, that we can intervene and stop things at that point. And we have a path put forward that helps us then to safeguard. How do we develop policies like that? And we help to train churches, both the leadership of the church, so that they're equipped to respond, as you were describing, Phil, in a way that honors God and cares for survivors and protects the vulnerable, kids, everyone really who's vulnerable within that faith community. And training for the whole congregation, because it doesn't rest just with leaders, it rests on all of us. Because if it is central to who we are, it's not just our leaders that are called to it, it's all of us. We are all called to this work because it was central to the ministry of Christ. And so this also is part of what Grace does. And these two things together help to move churches, help to move ministries forward in culture change. Again, bringing this to where it is not a checklist, but is about who we are. I hate to say this, but it's true. No matter how much work we do with a policy, no matter how much work we do with the training, eventually perpetrators are going to figure out the workarounds. They're going to be able to figure out how to get past the policy. And they're going to figure out techniques that go beyond any training we might do. But they can't get past the culture. If it truly is who we are, that becomes a greater safeguard than any policy we can develop, than any training we can do, because then it becomes part of our identity. It must be who we are. And that is advancing culture change. Tonight, as you've heard Kathy and Tim, as you've heard Phil speak, I hope that you can see the importance of advancing this work. And I hope that you would consider joining with us at Grace in moving forward with interrupting the pattern of abuse, giving voice to survivors, safeguarding the vulnerable, and advancing culture change. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can do this by donating. Right now, we have a pretty significant need. I mentioned how much demand has grown because so many churches are reaching out to us, over 500 churches and survivors last year. And this year will be more. More training, more consultations, more investigations than we have ever seen before. And in order to be able to respond well, in order to continue doing the work of giving voice to survivors, of safeguarding the vulnerable, of advancing culture change, we need to onboard at least 2 more people. And this is a lengthy process because we can't just put anyone into the job. We need to screen them well, and then we need to really mentor them into the culture of grace so that when they go out and train, they're prepared to handle when somebody after a training walks up to them and for the first time ever reveals their own abuse history. When a leader walks up to them and gives some scenario, they're able to respond and respond well. When they're called on to do an investigation, they're able to do that with integrity, caring for survivors, helping the church move forward and advance. So donating helps us to bring those people on, because we really need a 6-month period of mentoring those people on. And it helps to cover the expenses of both their time during the mentoring process and then the time of the people who will be mentoring them. There's another way that you can support us as well, and that is to join us in the Interrupting the Pattern campaign by being one of our fundraisers. This is a person-to-person fundraising campaign. And if you would consider joining us by being a fundraiser, that would be incredibly helpful. It would spread the word. It would help more people understand the importance of this work. And it would, again, further us towards the goal of bringing on these new people that we need to help interrupt the pattern. You'll note in the chat that Zane has put a link where you can click on that link and then be taken to the page where just through a few simple, easy steps, you can become one of the peer-to-peer fundraisers for the Interrupt the Pattern campaign. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Kathy and Tim. It has been an honor to work with you all in putting tonight together and in presenting this important message. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to listen and who's considering joining us in this work. I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you.